Hello there, and welcome back to the Level 2 lessons for the Star Wars Unlimited Judge program. As always, I'm your host Jonah, and we're going to talk about the philosophy of backing up and best practices to consider when faced with the decision to either rewind the game state or to leave things as they are and utilize a different remedy. In most policy lessons, I mentioned that policy continues to evolve. However, the ideas behind what makes a safe backup and what makes a risky backup will remain the same no matter what the policy is, as the foundational philosophy remains true. Now, what are rewinds? We discussed this partially in Level 2 Lesson 10, which covered communication and reversing decisions. It's important to remember that reversing decisions and rewinds are two very distinct categories. Reversing decisions come about when a player makes a play and realizes that they didn't want to make that play. Determining whether or not to allow reversing decisions should be dependent on the information that the player gained since they made the decision. Rewinds, on the other hand, come about from judges when a player takes an illegal action or otherwise breaks the game rules. Rewinds are a tool used to remedy the game. A rewind can be considered for missed mandatory abilities, missed game steps, or inaccurate gameplay. A rewind should not be considered for card manipulation errors, which are handled with separate policy. When we're fixing a game state, our goal is to get the most natural progression of the game possible. The only thing that should change is whatever illegal event occurred. Ideally, the rest of the game plays out the same way it would have had the error never been made. However, let's say a player plays a unit but doesn't exhaust enough resources for it because they don't have enough. They forgot about the taxing effect of Kira playing her part. Since then, the non-active player has attacked it with their own unit, but nothing else has changed. The rewind is relatively straightforward. We undo the attack from the non-active player, readying the unit, removing the damage from it and its target, and then we undo the illegal playing of the unit, readying the resources and returning it to hand or whatever zone it was played from. When we move forward, the game changes, because the non-active player isn't going to make the same attack, because they can't. But this is unavoidable, because leaving the game as is means that the active player would have a unit that they simply shouldn't have in play. If instead of attacking with the unit, the non-active player plays Super Laser Blast, what happens? Well, when we rewind here, we rewind the playing of the unit, and it's back in their hand, but the way the game plays out will be material different. Now, the active player knows about the Super Laser Blast, which they didn't have knowledge of, and naturally wouldn't have knowledge of had the game continued in the correct manner, so they might play different units or might not play units at all because of that knowledge. Because players take actions after illegal events occur, it is very common that information is legally revealed during the intervening period. While evaluating whether or not to rewind, you should take this gained information into account, but a player gaining information does not mean that you shouldn't rewind. Sometimes backing up and letting the game continue with the information isn't meaningful, other times it's very disruptive, and again, it comes down to your judgment as to which remedy is ideal. Another element to consider is whether or not cards have moved between two hidden zones. This generally happens twice in every regroup phase, when players draw cards and when players resource a card from their hand. In both of these situations, players move cards in a way that can't be cleanly rewound. We don't use the card manipulation error tools here because these cards have been legally drawn or played as a resource, and so we want to preserve that private information. And the card manipulations weren't errors, they were what was supposed to happen. The way we address cards moving from one hidden zone to another is by randomly selecting a card and then moving that card to the required zone. If cards are moved to a deck from a hidden zone, they generally should not be shuffled in. This is because the player legally had access to that card and may have made strategic gameplay decisions based on utilizing that card. Shuffling cards away can be very disruptive. However, if many cards were drawn, a card being returned to the deck may be 4 or 5 cards deep, which can also be very disruptive if it was a card that the player has been planning their strategy around. If there is some information whereby a subset of cards are known, if, for example, the opponent has just resolved Spark of Rebellion and noted which cards were in hand at the time, we can use that information to have the cards that are changing zones be limited to a subset of cards that we don't have confirmation on. As always, we want to preserve as much private information as possible. To undo a player learning the location of cards in their deck, we shuffle the random portion of the deck. To clarify, any cards that they learned the location of after the error will be randomized. Cards that they knew the location of before the error will be maintained. For example, if a player resolved U-Wing Reinforcement and knew the bottom 7 cards of their deck, then committed an error, those 7 cards would be maintained. However, if they committed an error, then played Ewing Reinforcement, those cards would be shuffled into the deck as part of the rewind. You can see that we're dealing with recreating random chance and potentially changing the outcome of the game with these rewinds. Furthermore, removing cards from the resource zone and putting them into a player's hand can be very disruptive. A card that is bad on turn 1 and resourced at the beginning of the game can be game-ending on turn 10. You should only rewind through regroup with extreme caution and when other options are not viable. Like with information, cards moving between hidden zones should be an indicator that you should consider other options, but it is not a hard line saying that you cannot rewind through regroup. Now, sometimes a player may get frustrated because they legally gained information. For example, they play Inferno 4 and the player learns the identity of the top card of their deck. If the error occurred before the Inferno 4 was played and we rewind through it, we shuffle away that card. If that card is the one that the player needed to win the game, they may be very resistant to the rewind. However, the top card of their deck, as long as it was unknown before the error was played, is just simply a random card that is in the player's deck, not a specific card. If it was a random card before the error, it needs to be a random card after the remedy. Some players may think that it was a specific card that they were entitled to draw because that's the order the deck was in, but they're not entitled to the specific card. They're entitled to a random card. If we leave the card where it was, for example, now the player doesn't need to play the Inferno 4 after the rewind to gain that information because they already have it, which could change their lines of play in an unnatural way and is something that we want to avoid. If a rewind would result in neither player changing their decisions, it's potentially a good indicator for resolving now instead of rewinding. If the only thing that happens is that players would make the same plays but with an additional resource exhausted, going through the process of rewinding everything between the error and the present is likely unnecessary and you can just exhaust that resource. To determine this, ask the players away from each other how the rewind would impact their lines of play. If a player is uncertain or is confident that their lines of play would change if things happened legally, that is a reason to strongly consider rewinding, even if resolving now would wholly fix the situation, especially if that player is the opponent of the player who made the error. While we want the game to progress naturally as though no error had ever occurred, we leave that perfect timeline as soon as the error is made. Holding players to decisions that were made based on untrue information leads to frustrated players, especially if we're otherwise changing this timeline. Sometimes, a player won't take an illegal action, but will instead communicate something inaccurately. They may say that they have 2 cards in hand when they have 3, or that a unit has 4 damage on it when it has 5. Often, these errors are caught quickly or as soon as a player makes a decision based on them. A player choosing to play an event that forces their opponent to discard a card will see that they have 2 cards in hand after it resolves and realize the error. A player who attacks a unit and then sees that it's not defeated will realize that the amount of damage on it was incorrect. These communication errors are a branch of gameplay disruption, as the miscommunication has changed how the game plays out, and proper communication about the game state is part of not only the tournament regulations, but the comprehensive rules as well. However, the remedy for these is slightly different than most other gameplay disruptions. Because a decision was based on poor information, resolve now isn't going to be a fix that remedies these situations. Similarly, leaving as is doesn't help address the situation, and the player who's disadvantaged did everything right. They asked for information to make a decision, they didn't just make an assumption. This category of communication errors can feel related to reversing decisions as well. A player says, "How many cards do you have in your hand?" Non-active player says 2, active player plays Spark of Rebellion, and the non-active player reveals 3 cards. Active player says, "Wait, if you have 3 cards, I don't want to play Spark of Rebellion." How is this different than the active player simply playing Spark of Rebellion without asking any questions, and then after the non-active player reveals 3 cards, the active player saying, "Wait, I thought you had 2 cards. I don't want to play Spark anymore." In both situations, the active player wants to change their line of play. Both times because they gained the information that their opponent has 3 cards in hand, not 2. However, in the first example, the non-active player took an active role in providing this information and provided incorrect information. This makes the situation a gameplay disruption and not a reversing decisions situation. To fix a communication error, we perform a rewind, but not to the point where the communication was made. rewinding all the way back to where the incorrect communication occurs doesn't actually matter, because while that was illegal, we can't actually change the words that the player said. And the first impact of the error is when the active player made a decision based on the faulty information. Therefore, in the above example, we would rewind to right before the active player played Spark of Rebellion. Even if the sequence was the active player asking how many cards the non-active player had in hand, then attacking, then playing a unit, and then playing Spark of Rebellion. If playing Spark was the first action that they took based on the information that the player received from their opponent, that's how far back we'll rewind. Like with other situations, this is something that you'll have to actively investigate to identify the player's communication and decision-making process. Sometimes the action occurs immediately after the communication, and so the rewind does go back all the way to where the information was communicated. Other times, the information was never acted on, and so you don't need to rewind at all. However, even if you're not rewinding, it is generally correct to issue a gameplay disruption for the communication error. Note that a player choosing to not do something is equally relevant as a player choosing to take a specific action. It only matters if the decision was based on the faulty communication or not. Sometimes, at larger events, judges will be asked to consult with some subsection of the judge staff when they're considering a rewind. Sometimes this is restricted to just the head judge, sometimes it's the head judge and their team leads, and sometimes it's consult with any other judge. As we've mentioned several times throughout this lesson, rewinds can be very disruptive. Judges may have different tolerances and judgments of the feasibility of a rewind. Inversely, some judges may have less experience and may be more hesitant to rewind a situation that can be resolved because they feel uncomfortable with the level of disruption to the match, and a more experienced judge can more smoothly navigate the remedy. By consulting with other judges, frequently more experienced judges, it creates a smoother and more consistent experience for players. Over time, you will begin to develop an understanding of when you can and should rewind, and what circumstances you shouldn't rewind. When coming to another judge to consult for a rewind, if they haven't been involved in the call, there are a few best practices. 1. Identify that you're consulting for a rewind and that this is a live call. 2. Indicate whether you think a rewind is feasible and correct or not right at the beginning. 3. State the error and the actions that followed chronologically. 4. Explain the rewind step by step. 5. This is optional but recommended. Bring the judge to the table where the players are so that they can observe the game state directly, maybe ask a few clarifying questions. And 6, also optional, take a picture of the board state with your phone so that you can show it to the judges you're consulting with, rather than trying to memorize everything. Of course, as soon as you return to the match with a rewind in hand, the players will add, "Oh, and one more thing," or "Is it important for you to know that everything's completely different?" Anyways, that about wraps us up on this lesson. Of course, there's a lot more to talk about, and future lessons will have even more explicit examples and scenarios. Our next lesson covers card manipulation errors, which have a similar level of potential complexity and can be disruptive to the match. If you're watching this on YouTube and you want more Level 2 lessons in your feed, go ahead and subscribe. Join us Tuesdays and Fridays on twitch.tv/SWU_judges for live broadcasts covering the content of these lessons as they're released, and join the Star Wars Unlimited Judge Program Discord to join the community and discussion of this and much, much more. As always, good luck and have fun.